It's another great episode of Royal Black and Elite. I want to welcome everyone. Thank everyone. It's Lady T, Lady TrenettWIlson. I am a social historian and a lecturer. And I want to shout out who's who in Black Dallas. I was inducted and I was so excited to be a part of the ceremony. So it's always wonderful to have your community recognize what you do. I want to thank everyone, as always, for tuning in. Your comments, your likes, your subscriptions, they all make such a difference. I can't thank you enough. And it has been so interesting meeting you here down in the comments to find out what you want to learn about and how you're enjoying the videos. Today is all about fashion. When it comes to the subject of fashion, most people don't know any black designers. And if they do, some may know Ann Lowe. She was the designer of Jackie Kennedy Onassis's wedding dress, along with her bridesmaids as well. An absolute style icon, and still hasn't gotten the recognition that she deserves for the fashions that she designed. I'm going to do a video on her. I'm doing Fashion Week, and she's going to be one of the ladies that we talk about as we discover more of the elite blacks who worked amongst such high and powerful people. Or some may be familiar with Zelda Barber Wynn Valdez, and she was a very famous designer. She designed the Playboy bunny outfit, as we see here, and one of the most iconic outfits that continues to endure today, which is that tight fitting, body fitting dress. So, those may be some of the women that come to mind when you think about fashion. But we're going to go all the way back into the 1800s because there was a woman who stood above the rest and who really was the forerunner and opened the door for these other wonderful women to become fashion designers. And her name was Madam Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley. Born a slave on February 24th, 1818, in a literal courthouse, Madam Elizabeth was born in Dinwiddie, Virginia. Her mother was an enslaved African mixed race woman who was believed to be from some aristocracy. But despite her aristocracy, she was still a slave in America, and she was under the ownership of Armistead Burwell. Now, Burwell was a colonel during the War of 1812, and it is believed that he owned about 50 slaves. He had a horrible reputation for the treatment of his slaves, and his wife, Mary, wasn't much better. In fact, she was angry and very jealous of Elizabeth because she knew that Elizabeth was her husband's child. And so she mistreated her very badly. One incident that Elizabeth put in her book was when she was 4 years old, she was actually put in charge of the Burwell's new baby, their infant, which would have been her half brother or sister. And I don't know any 4-year-old who can take care of an infant. So, of course, Elizabeth did a bad job. One incident in particular where she said she pulled back the baby bed and pulled it too far, and the baby flipped out of the bed. And she was beaten mercilessly for that. And so the Burwells did not treat her well at all. The only bright spot in her childhood was the relationship she had with her mother. And her mother taught her everything she knew about the craft of sewing and about the art of fashion. Her name was Agnes, and Agnes was a master seamstress. In fact, she was tasked with sewing clothes for 82 people who lived on the Birdwell plantation. Now, she had to sew for 12 of the family members and 70 of the enslaved people. Agnes, known as Aggie, was married to George Pleasant Hobbs. Now, he was a slave from a neighboring plantation. So she grew up in a mother and father situation, even though rumors on the plantation was that, in fact, Burwell, the plantation owner, was her father. Agnes's husband was sold away. They never saw each other again. So that was sad to see. But there are letters that exist that show that they did stay in communication, Agnes and her husband, and she did stay married to him to the day that she died. Growing up, Keckley wasn't real sure who her father was, but her mother finally did disclose that it was Burwell right before her death. So far, she's off to a rough start, but it got even rougher because at 14, the Burwell man, he loaned her to his brother, who was broke, and so he needed some help, and he loaned her out to him. And the minister ran a girls' school. His wife Margaret, she also disliked Elizabeth, maybe because she was young and beautiful, maybe because she knew she was mixed race. I don't know what it was, but she also did not like her at all. They even allowed their neighbor to beat Elizabeth. Oddly enough, though the Burwells owned slaves, they were hurting financially. So Robert would loan Elizabeth out to different people. And in fact, he loaned her out to someone named Alexander M. Kirkland, who was a neighbor of his. And he violated Elizabeth, and she had a son as a result. His name was George, and he was born in 1839. He was her only child, and it was sad that they had to go through that and that she had to go through that. Not only that happened, but after her son was born, she had to serve as the Birdwell's daughter's servant, and her name was Mary Garland, who also moved around a lot, and they ended up in St. Louis, Missouri. Keckley was not only a slave, but because the Burwells were so broke, she had to bring in extra money by sewing. She took care of the 17-member family. So it was 17 members of the family in the Garland family. She took care of all of them, and she had to sew on behalf of the family in order to bring money into the house because they were so poor. In 1852, Madam Keckley negotiated her freedom after saving extra money from her sewing, and Mr. Garland agreed that she could buy her freedom for $1,200, which is approximately $32,000 today. And she had to buy her freedom for her son and for herself. And her benefactor loaned her some money. So on November the 15th, 1855, Keckley bought her and George's freedom and remained another 5 years to pay off the entire debt. Now, in 1860, that's when things really kicked off for Elizabeth. Because she moved to Washington, D.C., her life would never be the same again. The only hurdle she had to overcome was to have the financial and registration requirements to become a resident of the city waived. And because of a call from her benefactor to the mayor, it happened. So she didn't have to pay any of the fees, and she was living as a free woman along with her son in Washington. Her benefactor made another call, and it really set Elizabeth on her path. It was to the high-ranking wives of political officials in the city. So she began with Jefferson Davis's wife. Her name was Verena Davis, and she was known as a fashion icon. And in recent years, it's been discovered or questioned about if she is a mixed race woman. So very interesting, because Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. So at any rate, she began with Verena, and then she moved on to her biggest client, who then paid her to work with her exclusively. Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln. She is the wife of the former President Abraham Lincoln, to some one of the best presidents that the country of the United States have ever had. So here it is in this time period where President Lincoln and slavery and abolition, all these things are going on. And behind the scenes, a Black woman, a former slave who had worked her fingers to the bone and who had risen to where she is right now in this moment, dressing the First Lady of the United States. And boy, did the people love her. In fact, when she first started, she was paid $2.50 per day. But by the time she opened her dress shop, her dresses were described as expensive. In fact, the Washington Bee called Miss Keckley a socialite. In April 1862, the District of Columbia emancipated slaves, and though she had already bought her freedom, The threat now of being re-enslaved had now legally been eliminated. She used her money for great purposes. She established the Ladies' Freedom and Soldiers Relief Association to help newly freed slaves resettle by providing financial and assistance and shelter. And her activism, well, listen, it says her activism allowed her an opportunity to introduce Abraham Lincoln to Sojourner Truth. Meanwhile, her styles were ripping up the runway, from her ball gown to the checkered design that still lasts and is worn all over in pajamas. I think that was a theme like only a couple of years ago today. And here's Mary Todd Lincoln's dress, as well as a christening gown that Madam Keckley designed. At the height of her career, she had 12 seamstresses, and she lived in this magnificent house. All was going well until President Lincoln was unfortunately stripped from the world. After the stripping, the Lincolns had great financial difficulty. Mary could not keep up with a lot of bills. They had to sell a lot of personal things, and right there by her side was Madam Keckley. Now, some say they bonded over the fact that they had both lost children. In 1861, George lost his life during the Civil War, and he was fighting on behalf of the Union. And only a year later, William Wallace, nicknamed Willie, that was the Lincoln son, and he succumbed to typhoid fever. So they had a shared hurt. Now her husband was gone. So Elizabeth really walked close with Mary during that time. Unfortunately, however, the closeness ended up in a tell-all. Behind the scenes, 30 years a slave and 4 years in the White House, where Elizabeth shared all of the secrets about the Lincoln family. Now, she said she did it to help raise money so that Mrs. Lincoln could afford some of the bills. But she didn't take it that way. She ostracized her. She stopped talking to her, and many of her clients did as well. In fact, the big, beautiful house she lived in, she had to move out of. And the very home that she had founded for destitute women, she had to live in herself. And the only money that she had coming in was the money that her son had left from his service in the war. Not until recently have anybody even knew who Elizabeth Keckley was and the great career that she led. Although her fortune was stripped and she was stripped of everything, her work still stood, and she is the woman who was the designer to presidents' wives. And now we see the monuments that have gone up in her honor, including this bronze statue that was put up by the Virginia Women's Movement. Such an interesting life. I wish she hadn't written that tell-all, but you know what? It may have been therapeutic for her, because she said 30 years a slave. So she lived a long life as a slave, and that really resonated with her. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode of Royal Black and Elite. Look up Elizabeth Keckley, learn a little bit more, and I'm going to keep bringing you great videos. Don't forget to press like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you on another great episode.